By late 1968, the Rolling Stones had released their 7th studio album, Beggars, Banquet. It marked a return to their blues roots after their disastrous experiment with psychedelia. The group collectively breathed a sigh of relief when the reviews came in. Their producer Gimmie Miller had served them well. They had returned to form. Now with their next album, Let It Bleed, the Stones wanted to cement their new identity as a blues-inspired rock band. The recording of Let It Bleed and the songs written would date back to mid-1968. The group now aimed to hold the position of the biggest rock group in the world. As the Beatles' Revolver had been to Rubber Soul, Let It Bleed was a continuation of Beggars Banquet. The Beatles had released a self-titled album in November. It split critics who praised their diversity and experimentation, with others dismissing some tracks as avant-garde pretentious junk. Jimi Hendrix had released Electric Ladyland in October, his third and unfortunately his final studio album. It was groundbreaking, a psychedelic guitar-driven masterpiece that redefined rock music. The Velvet Underground had released their second album at the start of the year. White Light, White Heat, like its predecessor, embraced an unconventional, unpolished style of songwriting and recording while not being as groundbreaking or influential. Like their first album, it too failed to make any commercial impact. In fact, it sold worse, peaking as low as 199 in the Billboard charts. The Byrds had released their 5th studio album, the notorious Byrd Brothers, at the beginning of the year. For the group, it was innovative and ambitious. It was unfortunately lost in comparison to its contemporaries. Stones at this point were not happy with their label Decca Records. The argument over the Beggars Banquet sleeve had left the Stones to compromise with something they didn't really want. Instead of the graffiti-covered toilet cubicle, they now had a blank white cover with Rolling Stones' Beggars Banquet in bank script font. It also featured the letters RSVP in the bottom left corner. Decca had reworked the cover as a formal invitation to a banquet. This was the last straw. They were contractually obliged to deliver 2 more albums for the label, but following that, Decca and the Rolling Stones would part ways. Mick Jagger had finished the filming of Performance. When it was released, it baffled critics who to this day can't make heads or tails of it.
In the final scene, the character that is supposed to be Chaz, who was played all the way through the movie by James Fox, is actually played by Mick Jagger, so their identities have completely merged. What on earth it was about is anybody's guess. I still think to this day, most people who've seen it really don't understand what it was about.
Brian, at this point, in the words of Mick, wasn't functioning as a musician. He moved into a farmhouse in the countryside. He drank the days away and began to gain more weight. This year would see him thrown out of the band, struggled to pursue his own musical endeavours, and ultimately, while all of his house guests left him unattended, he would drown in his swimming pool. Throughout the recording of the album, Brian would struggle to find his niche. He was unable to get it together and doesn't feature on guitar throughout the entire record. He'll miss sessions and barely be present when he attends. This is the story of the Rolling Stones' Let It Bleed.
We've got sights and sounds and marvels to delight your eyes and ears, and you'll be able to see the very first one of those in a few moments.
A month before the release of Beggars Banquet, the Stones had gathered in the studio to record one of Mick's songs titled You Can't Always Get What You Want. When talking later about who had penned the song, Keith later stated, the track was all Mick. Depending on what you read, some believe Mick wrote it about Anita Pallenberg and her disinterest in being in a relationship with him. Others believe Mick was making a comment on the shift in attitude towards the flower power movement, with optimism now beginning to wane. The woman with a glass of wine waiting for her connection was said to be Mary Ann, and Mr. Jimmy, who looked pretty ill, was said to be their producer Gimmie Miller. Had worked the basics out on acoustic guitar before showing Keith. In the studio, Keith strummed the chords in open E, while Charlie Watts played along a rhythm that producer Gimmie Miller had suggested to him. Gimmie Miller himself was a drummer, and when Charlie was either unenthusiastic or unable to play the rhythm correctly, Miller decided to play drums for the song. Charlie later said, Gimmie Miller wasn't a great drummer, but he was great at drumming on records, which is a completely different thing. Charlie also credited Gimmie with making him a better studio drummer. Brian didn't participate in the song at all. He lay on the floor reading newspaper articles throughout the entire recording. Keith would later add the lead. Following this session, recording would stop and not continue until February of 1969. 2 days after the recording, Mary Ann Faithfull suffers a miscarriage. It devastated both her and especially Mick. He was longing to have a child with Mary Ann, while at the same time, she was still legally married to her husband John Dunbar, who was still hoping they would reconcile. On December 4th, a launch party was held in the Gore Hotel in Kensington for Beggars Banquet. Originally, they'd wanted to hold it at the Tower of London to continue the medieval theme, but it wasn't available. The group, along with 120 media guests, ate a 7-course meal over candlelight. They sat eating dressed in Dickensian suits. Afterwards, a food fight commenced, starting with Mick pushing a custard pie in Brian's face. Brian revelled in this, according to some, because it made him feel like he was part of the group. Pies began being thrown with Charlie and Bill ducking down and the owner of the house attempting, unsuccessfully, to shield himself with a copy of Beggars Banquet. Keith wasn't present at this point. The event hit the news and Mick wrote a letter to the Gore Hotel thanking them and apologising for the mess. Brian, during this time, had moved into Cotchford Farm. He was in a relationship with Suki Potier, though he still missed Anita Pallenberg. When he was unpacking his luggage into his new home, he came across a picture of Anita. His father witnessed him whispering her name over and over. At this point, Mick was thinking of other ways to promote the songs on Beggars Banquet other than a press conference or live concert. It had now been 7 months since the group had performed a live show. Mick now hired director Michael Lindsay Hogg to direct a television show. It was decided to play a recorded live set mixed with circus-themed entertainment amongst a carnival atmosphere. Set in a big circus tent, the event would be aired on the BBC at Christmas and featured groups such as The Who and John Lennon's supergroup The Dirty Mac. The Rock and Roll Circus, Mick envisioned being a groundbreaking fusion of music and spectacle. On the 11th of December, the Stones and several other groups gathered at Wembley Studios. The Stones put the money up for the event themselves, as this would give them complete creative control. The group's wives and family were in attendance, and though Yoko Ono, Mary Ann Faithfull and Anita Pallenberg were included in the production, Brian, Bill and Charlie's girlfriend weren't considered. The supergroup known as the Dirty Mac, according to Bill Wyman, was to feature him as the bassist. But as Keith wanted to be part of the group, and seen as John Lennon was playing electric rhythm and Eric Clapton was playing electric lead, he would have to take bass. Acrobats, jugglers, clowns and fire eaters performed in between sets. The event was fun but haphazard. While John Lennon was asked what amp he wanted to use, to which he replied, "One that plays," news came in the boxing kangaroo wouldn't be arriving. Other reports about the boxing kangaroo state Yoko Ono approached Michael Lindsay Hogg and told him, should the event feature boxing kangaroos, Lennon wouldn't be involved. The event began on noon on the 11th of September, Mick acting as ringmaster, with the other Stones and Lennon miming trumpets and flutes. Originally, each of the Stones was to introduce the acts, but Brian and Bill's parts were later cut. Brian and Bill's introductions were later included as an extra in the 2019 DVD.
And now, the clowns.
Okay, and now for all you moms and pops and kiddies and everybody, a special surprise. To play the piano, Mr. Julius Katchen.
Lennon's introduction was later filmed while Michael Lindsay Hogg was shooting the Beatles' Get Back sessions. When all was said and done, the Stones watched back the performance on film, but Mick was unhappy. He insisted it was not up to standard. He felt they'd been upstaged by The Who and their performance looked unimpressive. Michael Lindsay Hogg argued their set was a perfect climax to the film. The Stones didn't agree and it was decided to reshoot the performance. This time it would be an outdoor setting, but when they got a quote for how much it would cost, the project was shelved. Though not used as a promotional tool, one thing they had gained from the event, it brought Mick and Keith back together. Had fallen apart with the events of Mick and Anita on the set of performance. This had stabilised the two. As 1969 began, Keith decided to buy a second property. Mick was the only Stone at this point who owned 2 properties, and maybe this was the catalyst. Keith's second property was even on the same road as Mick's. Mick owned 48 Cheney Walk, and Keith was purchasing number 3. To complete the purchase, Keith contacted Alan Klein's offices in New York for the money, but there was no response. After repeated phone calls, to which Klein ignored, Tom Keylock was sent over to New York to get the money. Keylock was ready to do whatever it took to get Keith's money, and he came back with the $20,000 needed.
The Stones security man, Tom Keylock.
Punch up, you know. No. Later on, if you all want to have a punch up with me, one at a time, when I've got a 12-ball shotgun, we'll all have it. Right.
Meanwhile, Brian was also having problems with Klein. The album he'd recorded in Jujuka the year previous wasn't being released. He'd edited the tapes and done the artwork with a friend. It had been finished in September of '68, and it was now January of '69. Klein was basically putting his attentions into becoming the Beatles' manager and ignoring his other responsibilities. Brian was also beginning to have cash problems. Brian now had 2 convictions, which meant he would not be allowed to tour in America. He appeared in court in an attempt to have the last conviction overturned. He feared with no touring there would be no money coming his way. The appeal was denied. In appearing in court, he'd had to cancel his plans to fly to Jujuka to take part in a music festival. He'd been invited to come and dance while the rites of Pan would be performed. Nobody blamed him for not turning up. It was a yearly tradition, and instead they expected him next year. After Brian's death, the leader of the master musicians of Jujuka commented, "Allah took him away. He died before he could really help us." On the 9th of February, recording continued with the song Midnight Rambler. Loosely based on the Boston Strangler, it was written by both Mick and Keith. They'd wrote the song while in Italy. Mick played harmonica during the song, with Keith on acoustic hummingbird in standard tuning and open E on electric lead. Brian added percussion. As he was unwilling to play guitar, Keith filled in the slide parts. With constant tempo changes, the song ended up as a kind of blues opera. Guitar solo took a whole week to get down. Night after night, Keith would come in, and if the atmosphere wasn't right, they'd try it again the next day. At the same time, Brian turns his music room, which is also his living room at Cotchford Farm, into a rehearsal space. It contains 2 organs, guitars, amps, and a drum kit. Though friends come over and play, Brian still refuses to play guitar and isn't in much of a fit state. That same week, they begin their 3rd composition for the album. One of Keith's songs, a ballad titled "You Got the Silver," written about his girlfriend Anita Pallenberg. Silver meaning money, the message of the song was a loving relationship is immensely valuable. A country folk love song, the composition featured Keith singing lead. Not originally though. Mick recorded the lead vocal around this time, but in months to come during the mix, engineer Glyn Johns accidentally wiped his voice. Producer Jimmy Miller had told Johns to add some reverb to Keith's guitar. It was the first time he'd ever done it. The confusion caused the wipe. Johns was mortified. Mick was in Australia, so they couldn't re-record him, and the only option was Keith. It was a lucky mistake. Keith plays his acoustic hummingbird in open E with a capo on the 1st fret. Slide is played on an electric Maton SE777. Keith acquired the guitar when a guest had stayed at his house. He'd brought the guitar over, but in the morning he was gone and he'd left his guitar behind. Brian did feature on the song playing auto harp. On the 28th of February, Brian turned 27. Mick had a bunch of flowers sent to his house. Around this time, Mick was offered a second film role, this time playing notorious Australian criminal Ned Kelly, with Marianne Faithfull being cast as Kelly's wife. Keith and Anita were steadily using heroin at this time. Anita was obsessed with black magic. So obsessed, in fact, she carried around garlic everywhere she went and took it to bed with her to warn off vampires. She also began performing rituals and while doing so, told others not to interrupt her. Next, the Stones begin on the only cover to feature on the album, Robert Johnson's Love in Vain. The story follows a narrator losing the love of a woman. He follows her to the train station and watches her leave, the train leaving being a metaphor for the relationship ending. It was Marianne who convinced Mick to cover the song. Keith had first heard it in 1968. Both he and Mick loved it. When they decided to cover it, they didn't want to present it the same way Johnson had, so they began trying different arrangements. The emphasis was to not imitate Johnson. They added extra chords and gave it more of a country sound. Keith again played his hummingbird acoustic, adding his electric slide. Brian was not present for the session. He had no interest in being involved. When the Stones driver would arrive at Cotchford Farm to drive Brian to the session, he'd tell his girlfriend Anna Wolin to say he was sick and he couldn't make it. As the month comes to an end, they begin work on Keith's song titled Gimmie Shelter. In '68, he'd recorded a rough version on demo, then titled Gimme Some Shelter. The lines, "Oh, a storm is threatening my very life today," were in reference to Keith's fears he would lose Anita to Mick during their affair. London was also hit by a terrific storm when he'd written it. Keith had watched people taking shelter from his window. There is, of course, a double meaning in the song. The Vietnam War, the draft, the threat of being drawn into a violent battle never far away. In reference to war, Mick says it's just a shot away. In reference to peace, Mick says it's just a kiss away. Keith's guitar riff for the song, one of the most iconic ever heard. Johnny Marr of the Smiths later stated he'd never heard anything so perfect. Keith again played the Maton. Vibrato was used when he plugged the guitar into a Triumph Silicon 100 amp. The song featured a female lead on the chorus with Marianne Clayton singing. When she was belting out the lines, at one point her voice cracked. She insisted she do it again, but the Stones refused. They wanted the raw sound captured in the song. It fit the distress, uncertainty, and fear of the song's theme. On the 15th of March, recording sessions continue with You Can't Always Get What You Want. Mick and Keith now envisioned a choir singing on the record, and so the London Bach Choir had been recruited for this session. It didn't stop there though. Mick also included a horn section. This is the last time Brian Jones will attend a recording session. The track ended up 7 minutes 30 seconds long. In my opinion, the song was an example of overproduction. Too many chefs spoil the broth. The rendition, performed at the Rock and Roll Circus, to me, didn't need any further development. Meanwhile, Marianne Faithfull had begun using heroin. Mick worried about her drug use, while reportedly she was using the drug to get through her relationship with him. April 17th, the Stones resumed recording at Olympic Studios. They will continue work in Studio 2, moving from Studio 1, a decision they'd later regret. Studio 2 is much smaller, the bass and drums weren't as effective as they should be. They now began on their next track for the album. Monkey Man was another song written in Italy. It was said to have been written as a tribute to Italian artist Mario Schifano, though the lyrics clearly reference drug addiction. Keith plays electric lead, either his Les Paul or Telecaster with overdub slide. Brian Jones is again not present for the session. May 12th, the Stones begin their next track, Country Honk, the acoustic version of Honky Tonk Women. It dates back to December of 1968. Mick and Keith had written it in Brazil. They were staying on a ranch, and with the heat and the clothes they were wearing, they felt like cowboys living in Texas. It's been said the track was recorded in Olympic, but then completely redone in LA. Keith strums his acoustic Gibson Hummingbird throughout. This was one of the first times Mick Taylor plays on a Rolling Stones session. He adds some slide guitar on a cheap Hawaiian Selma. Bill Wyman is not present for the session. The same day, they begin work on their next track, Live With Me, a comical track written by Mick. The narrator wants his girlfriend to move in with him, but warns her of his chaotic lifestyle he underplays as Bad Habits. Mick Taylor again joined the band for the recording session. After this session ends, Mick and Keith want him to join the group permanently. Keith loved Mick Taylor, but he noticed he was very shy and very distant. Throughout their whole friendship, Keith said sometimes he was extremely funny when he was relaxed, but ultimately he found Mick Taylor the same character by the end of the Stones as the one he'd first met. Keith commented, "You knew everything about him in one day. In that respect, he was the exact opposite to Mick Jagger." May 18th, Mick's next film, Ned Kelly, is announced to the public in a press conference. Marianne's role is also changed from his wife to his sister. 10 days later, Mick walked out of his house on Cheney Walk on his way to another recording session when he was met with a carload of police. Marianne, who was in the kitchen at the time, looked out to see Mick being held by a group of men. They were in plain clothes, and she thought he was being attacked by thugs. Marianne raced out of the house. When the door opened and she exited, Mick shouted, "Shut the door, you silly twit. It's the police." It was a very suspicious arrest. It was clearly another tip-off, as with Redlands in '67. Nobody knew who tipped the police off, but there are strong suspicions it was Tom Keelock. The next day, Mick and Marianne appeared in court, charged with possession of marijuana, 4 ounces to be exact. They both pleaded not guilty. They were released on bail, and the case was adjourned until June 23rd. June 2nd, the Stones begin recording their next single, Honky Tonk Women. They had decided to transform the acoustic song Country Honk into something fuller. Mick Taylor will again play on the session. June 5th, recording begins for the title track Let It Bleed. Legend had it, the title came when Keith had been playing guitar for hours during a session. His fingers began to bleed, to which Mick and Jimmy Miller argued whether they should continue. Other accounts say Mick came up with the line as a satanic Aleister Crowley reference. Possibly Let It Bleed was a drug reference, the aftermath of shooting heroin. Either way, everybody loved the title. The track features Keith strumming his acoustic Gibson Hummingbird. His slide guitar also features occasionally. Recording sessions continue, and after the mix on Country Honk is complete on June 8th, a decision is made concerning Brian Jones. Brian wasn't functioning as a musician, he wasn't able to tour America, and also he didn't fit in with Mick and Keith's vision for the band. He could no longer be a Rolling Stone. Mick and Keith were going to be the two who would tell Brian. On this day, they visited Brian at Cotchford Farm. In case things turned chaotic, they brought Charlie Watts along as peacemaker. Keith was the one who told Brian he was out of the band, and Mick backed up Keith's words, saying they couldn't continue with him and offered him a substantial payout and a certain amount of money each year the group stays together. The visit lasted all of 30 minutes. According to some, Brian was unhappy about the news, but his main fear had been money issues. The reassurance of an income, the firing had been easier to digest. The next day, a press release announces Brian Jones is leaving the Rolling Stones due to musical differences. The quote from Brian reads, "I no longer see eye to eye with the others over the discs we're cutting." The quote from Mick reads, "We've decided that it is best for him to be free to follow his own inclinations. We have parted on the best of terms. We continue to be friends, and we're certainly going to meet socially in the future." When asked what Brian's future plans musically are, Mick tells a reporter, "You'll have to ask him what he's got on his mind. He hasn't said anything to us." 4 days later, the Stones hold a press conference in London's 350-acre Hyde Park. Mick Taylor is interviewed as a Rolling Stone for the very first time, and they announce there will be a free concert taking place at Hyde Park on the 5th of July. June 23rd, Mick appears in court for his drug hearing. The case is adjourned again until September 29th. This will give Mick time to shoot Ned Kelly in Australia. On July 3rd, Brian Jones drowns in his swimming pool at Cotchford Farm. He was, according to 2 of the 3 people at the house, very intoxicated. The The Stones hear of the news while in Olympic Studios. It shocks the group. It's expected the Hyde Park concert that is due to take place in 2 days will be cancelled. It isn't. Mick releases a statement saying the concert will go on, but it will be a tribute to Brian. The idea of a tribute concert had come from Charlie Watts. On the news of Brian's death, Anita Pallenberg states, "I'll see him again. We promised to meet again. It was life or death. One of us had to go." On the matter of his drowning, she would state, "There was no one there who knew what to do. He'd been in that state many times, but there'd always been people there to help him." Anita, according to various people, Marianne being one of them, suffered some psychotic episode following Brian's death. She cut pictures of Brian out of magazines and put them on her wall before going to sleep. Then when she'd wake up, she'd destroy them. Heavily into witchcraft and the occult, she also believed Brian's spirit may be reincarnated in her soon-to-be-born child. Former girlfriend Suki Potier made a statement saying, "When my boyfriend was killed, Brian gave me a shoulder to cry on. He picked up the pieces and made me feel a woman again. I will never forget him. He was a wonderful, incredible person." The Stones used the Beatles' Apple basement recording studios to rehearse for the concert. In a week's time, Mick is due to leave for Australia to begin filming Ned Kelly. The filmmakers doubt his punctuality and already begin hinting at legal action should he not arrive on time. At this time, there's been a sudden heat wave in England. Mick was originally planning to wear a snakeskin suit for his performance at Hyde Park, but now it will be too hot. Instead, he will wear a white outfit that became known as a poet's blouse. On June 5th, the Hyde Park concert takes place. 250 to 500,000 people attend. A stage well over 6 feet high is built, with 30-foot scaffolding to hold the speakers for the open-air concert. As requested by Mick, palm trees decorated the stage, and there will be no VIP backstage passes. A carpet is also put on stage so Mick can take his shoes off and dance. Beneath the stage was a first aid casualty point. Hell's Angels are recruited as security, and the Stones wait backstage anxiously. Mick had told his friends he was terrified of taking the stage for the concert. The fans gather and sit in the smouldering heat. When it gets too much, some of them cool down by swimming in the 40-acre lake on Hyde Park. The Stones are coached to the stage by a dark green truck. As they look out, Bill Wyman remembers the crowd being peaceful. The smell of burning joss sticks wafts through the air. The performance begins a bit shaky, with Mick trying to read a eulogy for Brian while getting annoyed at the crowd. Hundreds of butterflies are then released, many of which had already died due to the heat. At the same time, the Stones burst into their first song, "I'm Yours, I'm Hers." Likely, they'd chosen this one to begin because it was one of Brian's favourite songs. After about half an hour, due to the heat, Mick tears off his white dress. The set ended with an 18-minute version of Sympathy for the Devil. The show was a great success. Some suffered heat stroke, but there was little to no reports of drunkenness or violence. When the crowds parted, they left 5 tons of rubbish behind. Volunteers then began cleaning up. They were rewarded each with a copy of the Stones' latest single, Honky Tonk Women. Days later, as agreed, Mick flew to Australia and began filming Ned Kelly. At the same time, Marianne Faithfull filed for divorce proceedings against John Dunbar. Let It Bleed marked the end of an era for the Rolling Stones. Brian Jones' years were over. Jagger's lyrics commented on the end of the 60s utopia so many envisioned. In his most brutal lyrics, he proclaims, "Rape, murder, it's just a shot away." Printed on the sleeve was the message, "This record should be played loud." The album surpassed Beggars' Banquet in terms of sales. Musically, they were both masterpieces. It comes down to a matter of personal taste to judge which is superior. Either way, it was a perfect follow-up. Stones had said goodbye to the 60s and now entered a new phase. They may have had a long journey as counterculture icons, but as far as rock legends, they had only just begun. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel, and if you wish to donate, it would be greatly appreciated. Just click the three symbols next to the video, then the thanks icon, and choose however much you wish to donate. Everything donated goes directly back into the channel to make better quality videos. As always, thank you for watching and stay tuned for the next video.